What's up guys, Hockey Ball here. Today is the second part of my test where we've got the GTX 980, the 980 Ti and the GTX 1080. We've done the test in the amplifier connected to the Alienware 15 laptop. We're going to perform the same 3D Mark tests here with the 1080 and 4K testing on all three cards. The 4K testing will be done on the 1080 and the 980 Ti, and they're going to be done in the Alienware 15 to my left. Obviously the difference between the machines is quite vast. I mean, the processing power, for example, is a 2.5 i7 in the laptop and a 3.36 core Haswell i7 in the Alienware 15. There's 32 gigs of RAM, which is double in the laptop as well. So there is hopefully going to be some decent differences between the two, and then we can compare in a third and final video. I'll compare the differences between both of these videos. We'll compare the card scores for 1080 and 4K and give us some percentages and differences between the two cards and how they square up when they're in the different rigs. Let's get stuck in.
Okay, so this is the GTX 980 that we've got in the Alienware Area 51 at the moment. We're doing the first graphics test. I've skipped the demo so we can just get down to the nitty gritty, because this is going to be a long night having to swap and reinstall graphics card drivers for every time we take the cards out. Clocking around about 60-70 frames per second in the first test. The GTX 980 has 2048 CUDA cores with a base clock of 1126 MHz and a boost clock of 1216 MHz. Texture fill rate is gigatexels per second. That is 144, and the memory clock is 7 gigabits per second. And obviously this is the 4 gigabyte graphics card, GTX 980. So it's the lowest of the three cards. The memory interface is standard GDDR5, which is the same as the Ti, and memory interface width of 256 bits, and a memory bandwidth of 224 gigabits per second. Hitting around about 50 frames a second is not too bad. Interesting to see how this score comes up. Physics test is going to be the same across the board, obviously, as we've got the same rig all the time, and it is much better than the Alienware 15. I imagine that will have a decent effect on the overall score compared to the amplifier, and that's probably where a bottleneck would exist if there is one. Here we are at 48 down to 40, so yeah, 40 to 40, 44, 46 sort of frames per second on the physics test. It's the only time really the CPU actually gets stressed above 36 degrees. Obviously we were running a water-cooled system. It's a 3.3 i7 Haswell 6-core processor, so it's got quite a kick. And we're running now onto the last test, the combined test, which is a graphics and a physics test. So the test is now completed, and 11,908 in fast rate with a graphics score of 13,755. Why is it an invalid score? Time measurement data not available. Okay, I'm not too sure why that is. Everything went through as normal. Pretty standard again. The CPU stressed up to 46. Graphics card dropped in between the tests and obviously on the physics. Graphics test 1 was 66.26, number 2 was 54.50, physics score 14,000, and a combined score of 5,314. So there we have it. I will now I'm not going to run a 4K version on the 980 because from my previous experiences it really did struggle on the amplifier, so I imagine it may just about handle 4K here, but I really want to see what the difference is between the 980 Ti and the 1080. So we'll swap now to the GTX 980 Ti, and then after that we'll swap to the 1080 and we'll do the same test. But the 980 Ti and the 1080 will have the 4K Ultra test as well. Okay guys, so this is on the Area 51. We are currently doing the Firestrike benchmark with the GTX 980 Ti. It is a reference card. It came with the tower itself. Not too sure how much difference between the two cards, between a reference card and an overclock card, but we'll leave that as a negligible really. We're just going to be running the same graphics test 1, 2, the physics score and the combined. Some basic specs about the GTX 980 Ti. It's got 2,816 CUDA cores with a base clock of 1,000 MHz, so that boosts to 1,075. Texture fill rate gigatext was per second is 176, a memory clock of 7 gigabits per second, and the standard memory card is a 6 gigabyte card, whereas the 1080 is an 8 gig and the 980 is a 4 gig. The memory interface width is 384 bits, and the memory bandwidth in gigabytes per second is 336.5. Currently on the second graphics test. I'm expecting a nice jump between this and the benchmark purely because of the processor. As before, the laptop is a 2.5 or a 3.5 if it's connected to the amp quad-core processor, whereas this is a Haswell K processor, so it's built to be overclocked and it's water cooled as well. So I'm expecting some nice frames. We're sitting around the 80 down to 60 frames per second. Once we have got all of the results from this and we can compare them, I'll do another video where we compare the cards between the amplifier scores and the Area 51 scores, so we can get an idea of any bottleneck or CPU bottleneck issues that we may unearth. As well, the 980 Ti is running on a Maxwell architecture, whereas the newer 1080s is on the Pascal. So the 980 and the 980 are both on Maxwell. So as expected on the Alienware 15, the physics score was around about 21, 22 throughout all of the tests, and here you can see it's 45 or thereabouts, between 42 and 46. So over double the difference. Running the last combined test now, which obviously does the graphics and the physics combined test. Also thought I should mention the GTX 980 Ti power supply is a 6-pin and an 8-pin, and it's running drain at 250 watts. More than a slight increase of 165 watts for the 980, which has two 6-pin power connections. I was impressed to see that the GTX 1080 only has the one 8-pin and it runs at 180 watts with the increased performance, so they're definitely doing something right there. Kicking out around about 35, 36, 37, 38, mid to high 30 frames per second. And here is the final result. 14,098. Graphics score was 16,247. Physics score, wow, that's an increase from what we've seen on the amplifier. Combined score 7,071. And yeah, as I was expecting, the CPU, it rarely goes anywhere. It's water cooled. 30. I think on the Alienware we're hitting 60, and then obviously it jumps up a bit to 44, 45 as it's doing the physics test. The GPU, as we would expect, it kind of reaches climaxes, and then in between the tests it drops down and then goes back up. Drops obviously in the physics where it's not being used, and back up in the combined. So as you can see here, yeah, NVIDIA GeForce GTX 980 Ti. The CPU is an Intel Core i7-5820K, Firestrike V1.1, and graphics test 1 was 79.32 FPS, and graphics test 2 was 63.67. So yeah, reasonably good score. What we're going to do now is I will swap the card out, and I shall drop in the GTX 1080 and see how that fares. Okay, so this is the 980 Ti again, but we're running the Firestrike Ultra, which is basically 4K. So we're going to get a bit of an idea to gauge how it would run if we were to subject it to some 4K abuse. I will cut part of this, obviously you don't want to watch it all again, and we will just cut straight to the results. I believe the 1080s and first I'd be scoring between 4,000 and 5,000 on 4K, so even though it's a lower score, I think it does indicate that it is 4K compatible. Obviously the higher the score the better it is going to be at playing certain games in 4K. Okay, so this is the result for the 980 Ti in the 4K Firestrike Ultra test. Just in case you're wondering, the reason why I'm able to do this test even though I don't have a 4K monitor is that the Firestrike program, it renders the benchmark testing internally at 4K resolution. So it renders it at 3840 by 2160 pixels. Basically checks to see that it's all working, and then it scales the output visuals down so they match the PC's native resolution screen of full 1080p. So that is how we're able to see if it's going to work in 4K without having a 4K monitor, because I'm sure that someone's going to come to that conclusion saying, oh, you don't have a 4K monitor. Well, that's how it works out. Okay, as you can see here, the GPU was going turbo, 83 degrees. We got a score of 3715, 21.05 FPS on the first, 13.11 FPS on the second. Physics score was pretty consistent to what we had last time, around about the 14,000, and a combined score of 2,050. So what we're going to do now is, obviously, we're going to go back to the GTX 1080, and we're going to try that in 4K. I'm not going to run the 980 in 4K because this one, it looks like it's just about scraped through with some relatively okay 4K gaming, but I want to see the differences between the two big boy cards, the 980 Ti and the 1080. The 1080. Okay, so this is the GTX 1080 in the Alienware Area 51. Had fun installing it. Frames on this one hitting 100 at the moment, which is nice. NVIDIA CUDA cores for this has got 2560, and the base clock is 1607 MHz with a boost clock of 1733 MHz, and a memory speed of 10 gigabits per second, so it's 3 gigabits per second quicker than the 980 Ti. This is an 8 GB card. It's obviously the GDDR5X memory, whereas the two previous were just GDDR5. And the 1080 is running on a new architecture. It's running on the Pascal architecture, whereas the two previous, the 980 and the Ti, are both on the Maxwell architecture. 100 frames again on this, so I'm expecting a very, very good score considering we've got the kick-ass 6-core Haswell processor and the 1080 in this. Like I said, the system's got 32 gig of RAM. It's a 3.36 core Haswell liquid cooled. It is literally should be a beast of a system. I'm incredibly excited to see what the 4K Ultra test fires out as well. I think the maximum resolution that this card supports is 8K, so I'm not even aware of any 8K panels that are yet available on the market. So okay, going for the combined test. Once again, this is physics and graphics combined. Should be a good score, as we've got a very good both now, a very good processor and a very good graphics card. And 30 frames. I mean, on the other cards, definitely the 980, it was a little bit juddery as well on this, so it is performing much better. And the results are in. What have we got? Drum roll. Okay, 15,971. A graphics score though of 20,760. The graphics test number 1 was 100.46 FPS. Graphics test 2 was 81.94. Physics score was 13.8, which is slightly lower than on the TI, not too sure why, with a combined score of 6,339. As you can see here, GeForce GTX 1080, same processor as before on the same system. And it had a little dip in graphics here, I'm not too sure why it dropped in temperature. As you can see throughout the test, it's dropping. It's dropping because obviously we've got in between the tests. I'm not too sure why. Maybe it's because it's running at a lower power than the 980 Ti. The 980 Ti is 250 watt, whereas this is, I think, 180, so it's a bit less. Processor, as always, is sitting around the 36 and drops up to, I think, 44 in the physics test. So yeah, not a bad score. 20,760 graphics is very good. I'm very impressed with that. What I'd like to do now is run the 4K Ultra test and see how we fare on that. So this is the test I think everyone's been waiting for. It's the GTX 1080 4K, the Firestrike Ultra 4K test. As before, I'm running a 1080p monitor, but this renders in 4K internally and then downscales it to 1080p, so that's how it actually gives you a 4K rendering score, basically. So I've skipped the demo because I don't think that's really needed. I just want to see what the graphics tests give out and what the overall score is. 27 frames per second. Frames. It looks nice. It's not juddery or flaky or anything like that. It seems pretty consistent, nice and smooth. I think it's test only 30 seconds, and the next one about 35, I believe. Graphics test number 2. They do say that the GTX 1080 is supposed to perform better than 2 GTX 980s in SLI, so hopefully this is reflected in the scores when we compare them all together. Now that one's dropped a little bit, around 15. That's jumped up to 25 frames now. It was about 13. Be interesting to see the GTX 1080 because they're EVGA bringing out super clocked and for the Win edition, so I'd like to see, because they've got a high clock speed, if there is a difference between the two of them. So if I was to get a 1080 card, I would probably go for one of them, but they're not out yet. They've not been released through my supplier, at least. They've got another couple of weeks before they're due. At least the super clock one, I think, is probably tomorrow. The full Win is next week. I think it's like the 5th of July it comes out. So physics score, same again. Pretty much the same every time, this score, but I included it on the first card, so I might as well run it through the whole lot just in case it does have any sort of effect. I want it to be a fair test. And the last test now is the combined test, where they do battle on the bridge. Be nice to see how juddery or unjuddery this is. I think this will be the defining moment when we combine them both together to see how they would play. Come on, the suspense is killing me. Okay, about 12 frames a second, so I was expecting slightly higher. Then bearing in mind this is 4K, whereas the other ones are kind of stuck at this on normal 1080. So interesting. What is the final result? A 4,000 and something, perhaps? Just under 5,000. That's not too bad. 4,914. Graphics 1 was 27.20 FPS. Graphics 2 was 17.31. Pretty consistent physics score between 13.9 and 14.1 is what we've been hitting every time. A combined score of 2,587 as before. GTX 1080, same processor, same machine. Consistent with the heat as well for the GPU and the CPU. Let's compare this result. Just jump that up. Okay. So the score is better than 70% of all results. Strange, because on the 980 Ti I ran a similar score with the non-4K when I compared it, and it was better than 90%. So it's interesting to see how they rate these. It's just my spec system there, the RAM and the number of cores, etc. Hyper-threaded cores, all good. So yeah, that is pretty much it for this video. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to cobble the two videos together in a third and final video where I compare the two, the Amplifier and the Alienware 15 and the Area 51. We'll compare the three graphics cards over both systems and we'll get some results printed up. And we can compare and get some percentages and see where the bottleneck is and what causes. Hopefully we get an idea of what is causing a bottleneck, if there is one at all. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you again soon.